Hey everyone, welcome back to the table. I'm Scott, and today we're going to go through our How to Make a Diorama series. This is going to be a 5-part series where we teach you how to make this diorama from start to finish. We're going to tell you what materials you need, what techniques you need to learn, show you those techniques, and how to make this thing look awesome. So come join us as we walk you through how to make that happen. Hey everyone, welcome back to the table. I'm Scott, and we're ready to start session 2 of our diorama making series. So last session, we put a lot of work into designing our diorama. We carved it out with the foam, started gluing down pieces. So this session, we're going to start off with demolding those rocks that we made out of plaster last session. We're going to work on putting sand on the beach, use plaster, and smooth out and cover up all the cracks and surfaces. Put down some ground cover using actual sand, and we're going to get everything ready to be painted for session 3. So we're going to put a layer of glue over the entire diorama to be able to protect it from aerosols. So come on and let's get started. So let's start with the first step, which is we're going to take our rocks that we had. Now, you might get a few pieces of aluminum foil that are stuck inside the crevices of here, and that's okay too. You can easily pick those out, or even if you have to, use a hobby knife to be able to cut a little piece of them out. So the process for demolding these is really simple. You're going to peel the sides down. We're going to set them back into the mold, textured face down, hit them or push down on them, and break them apart. Now, we don't want to break them down into little tiny pieces. So when you're breaking these apart, I don't recommend taking a hammer to them. That might be a little bit too aggressive, but you could take and just simply put pressure with the heel of your hand down onto the plaster itself. And you can see that it broke apart pretty easily from just a little bit of pressure. From here, you're going to have other pieces. So we're going to do that to the other one and have a nice base. Perfect. So it'll give us a nice base that we can work with. We'll probably break these apart more as we need them to place them down. All right, now that we have everything set up, we got our glue ready, we have our pieces of plaster, rock, tile, cliffside face ready, we're going to go ahead and start assembling. Now the best way to go is to take and find pieces that are going to be small enough to fit where you want them to go, and then simply glue them down with the hot glue. Now, what I'm trying not to do is butt them up exactly next to each other and try to recreate what I just broke up. I want there to be just a tiny gap in between it. Not all the cliff faces are going to be perfectly aligned to exactly the way it needed to be. We're actually going to fill the small gaps with plaster later on down the road. The places that we're going to put this are actually going to be the flat sides of the diorama, the places where we have a completely flat side that we want to have some texture on the side of it. But once you have them all on, then we're ready for the next step. Now, one of the things I neglected to mention about these is when you pull them out, there might be some dust on there. So what you can do is just take a damp paper towel and just wipe the back of the plaster off, so that way it won't have that powder coating on it. And then that'll help it adhere better to the foam when you are using the glue on it. So for the very next step, what we're going to do is take some plaster. I have some stuff that I just got from the hardware store. I like this stuff that has like a dry time indicator, so it helps me visually see when it is completely dry, because it changes color. It starts out pink, as you can see here on the camera, and then when it dries, it turns more white, or it turns white, and then you know it's dry. So now you can do this with your bare hand if you want to. I highly recommend using a glove because it makes it incredibly easy to clean up. You just peel the glove off and you're done. So that's the method we're going to use here. The goal with this is that we're going to do in between the cracks of each of the pieces that we just put down. Also, we're going to smooth in some of the other open spots within the diorama itself. Got some rogue glue there. We're going to fill in the spots within the diorama itself, and then we're also going to fill in some of the cracks along the sides of the diorama as well, or in the back and that, so that way the whole entire thing is contained and looks coherent into one single piece. Press it in between the diorama here. Now, we kind of want to like almost like paste it in. You don't have to get super aggressive with it, and you don't have to try to cover every square inch. The main thing that we're trying to do here is fill in the gaps and cracks within this. I'm also trying to make sure I fill in between the individual areas. Now, pieces like this rock that I have here are one of the ones that I don't necessarily want to completely cover all the gaps with it, because I kind of want it to look like the rock itself is actually sitting there. Now, I definitely could smooth it out, so if I had kind of an inclined plane, I could definitely do that. But some of it I want it to look a little rough and ragged, so that means that I'm not going to fill all the gaps. But this is a way for me to be able to do some of the things I couldn't really cut completely with the foam itself. We're going to go over some of this with sand. That's going to add a texture to it. So we don't necessarily have to worry exactly what this looks like. So you don't have to make it completely smooth. If it has a little bit of that texture there, that's perfectly fine. As you can see, we have part of this done already. All of the front part, I have some of the areas smoothed out so they look a little bit more of an incline, and I have all of the cracks in between the different pieces that were glued together are smoothed out as well. The other thing that you can tell is that on some of my hand already, you can see where the plaster's already started to dry and it changed color. This is one of the reasons I like the color changing. I'm going to go ahead and start working on the sides of in the back of the diorama to smooth those sections out as well. Here's a good example of what it would look like on the side when you're done. I smooth it over so that way you can tell the texture. You can't tell the texture between the gaps and the holes. Okay, the backside done. We're going to work on the final portion, which is the other side here. With our final side complete, let's show you it here. With our final side complete and marked up. Now this is the part where it works really handy. If you use a glove, you can simply take the glove off and your hand's clean. Our next step that we're going to work on is the sand on the beach. One of the things I had mentioned before with the beach is that we wanted to use something finer than actual sand. So I have an example of some sand right here, and you can see the texture. Even though it has a few stones in it, you can see the texture is a little bit thicker than regular, than maybe what you would expect for sand down below. Also, once you put glue on it, it tends to get a little bit thicker because the glue will be on the granules. However, we can use baking soda, and this will work perfectly for sand. And the texture of baking soda is a lot smaller than the sand. So what we're going to do to actually make the mixture for the beach, because we just don't want to pour baking soda onto it, that's going to look a little weird and tacky as well. Also, baking soda has the tendency to turn color after a period of time. We're going to mix it with some paint and a little bit of glue that's going to help seal it and protect it and prevent that coloring from happening. So to do that, we're going to use our bucket. I'm going to pour some baking soda in here. I'm going to pour a fair amount because we're going to be mixing and covering a pretty large area. And remember, you can always make more if you need to. Now, the other thing is we've got to determine how thick we want this to be on the side. I'm going to want it to be up a decent amount because we're going to pour a thin layer of resin. And I want for the water, and I want the water to kind of come up on the beach just slightly. So we've poured our baking soda inside. Next, I'm going to use some matte medium, which is a good paint that doesn't have any particular coloring in it at all. So we're going to pour some of that in with the baking soda. Next up, we're going to add a little bit of glue to the mixture. I'm going to use another popsicle stick to go ahead and mix this all together. Once I have this to roughly a pasty type texture, then I'm going to actually spoon it out onto the diorama. If you prefer to work with your hands, feel free to do that, or if you have more gloves, you can use the gloves to help shape it as well. This is where it comes in handy that we have our line here, so I can actually use my line to give me a guideline, to know exactly where this should go. Now, it doesn't have to be perfect and exact. You can always take and change your mind as you go because of whatever reason. I want to build up our area where our resin's going to go. So I'm trying to create a little bit of a wall, if you will. Now, one of the things with this is you have a pretty good working time, so you can take your time. All right, I have this down, and I kind of created a wall along this edge, and then I smoothed it out and made it look a little bit more natural. Now what I'm going to end up doing is I'm going to take and sprinkle some baking soda over the top of this, just a little bit. It's going to help with the texture of everything. So with our beach complete, we're going to move on to one of the final steps that we're going to do with this session, and that's it. We're going to put some of the ground cover on the diorama itself. Now, this particular step can get rather messy, so one of the things I like to do is put down and have something underneath this that I'm going to be able to use to dump the sand off. So for glue, we're going to need a pretty decent amount of glue for the next several steps. So what I like to do is take and pour my glue into a empty Tupperware container that I don't need anymore, or maybe an old, in this case, a cheese container, and that way I can water it down and I can reuse it as I need to, and if it's going to be a little bit, I can simply put the cover back on. All right, I have my glue inside my container. Now what I'm going to actually do is, I don't want to use this full force. I want it to be a little more fluid and not so rigid. I also want it to be somewhat thin so it'll dry a little easier as well. If it's really thick, it takes a long time to dry. And actually, if you really make it thick, what will end up happening is they'll create like a protective layer over the glue, and then it never really dries. So I also recommend having a decent sized brush. A smaller brush isn't necessarily going to work. So an old paintbrush that you're no longer using, or maybe you go purchase one at the hardware store, get something that is like 1 to 2 inches would work quite well. Now, if you rinse this off right away, you can actually save the brush. You don't have to, glue works a lot like paint from the point of view that you can rinse it off your brush. So don't feel like you have to throw the brush away afterwards, but you can easily buy chip brushes or something like that at the hardware store, and that are disposable. But the key with those is that you want to be careful, because sometimes the cheaper brushes like that, the bristles will break off, and then you have to pick them out of your piece that you're making. And it's definitely the case if you decide you're going to try to reuse one of those brushes. So we're going to mix up our paints into, just make sure it's a consistency that is uniform. So what I'm looking for is something that's a little thicker than milk. Not quite as thin as milk or water, but about as thick as, a little bit thicker than milk, which is about perfect. It'll make it fluid and not create any type of pooling, and also I can easily spread it on the piece itself. The other thing that I want to have prepared for this is my sand texture and my rocks. I use old Tupperware containers for the sand, which actually this particular container works very, very handy. We use it for basing quite often as well. And so I'm able to put paint or put glue on the bottoms of the bases and dip them in and then shake them off. And it works quite well. So some of the places you can go get sand is if you happen to have a sandbox in your yard, that's an obvious place. They'll watch out for cat poo. But you can also go to the hardware store and get a large bag of it, or even just a decent sized bag of play sand. Some people like to sift their sand out so they don't have the little tiny rocks and pebbles in there. I personally like the rocks and pebbles. It gives it a little bit of character when I'm putting it down, because typically I'm using it for ground cover. We're going to start this process where I'm going to simply go on the exposed areas where I want to put some of the sand, and I'm just going to brush it and get it all over the areas that I'm planning on putting this. And if you do a little extra, that's okay. One of the things that we want to do is we're going to need to actually paint. We're going to put a layer of glue over the entire piece at one point in time. One, that's going to help seal it, but two, if we end up using spray paint to be able to paint the piece, we won't damage it. Any areas that I see pooling, I'm going to make sure I smooth those out. We have our glue over the entire thing. So now what we want to do is be careful to not get too much sand on the beach area. I know that sounds weird. You don't want to put sand on the beach area, but you know what I mean. So we're going to take and just simply sprinkle. We're going to sprinkle the sand lightly over top of the areas that we want to put the ground cover. And it's okay to go ahead and add a little bit more, because one of the things that we're going to get from this, whatever sticks to the glue, is what we want to use. Now later on, we're going to put grass over some of the areas, so it's okay that we cover quite a bit more than what we're expecting. In fact, I kind of think it looks a little bit natural if it kind of like falls down a little bit onto the areas. Now that we have sand on everything here, we're going to give this just a moment or two for the glue to, or for the sand to get absorbed into the glue. And when that's complete, we're going to make a huge mess. I say huge mess, I mean huge mess. Once we've let the sand take a moment or two to absorb in, we're going to actually dump the diorama out and pour the excess sand onto our mat. This is kind of the fun part, but also the messy part. Notice there's really not that much sand that came off of this. Perfect. I'm actually going to set this aside for a moment, fold it, and pour everything. I'm going to pour all of this into my container so I can reuse it for later. All right, we have our sand on. The last step that we have for this particular session is that we want to put a final coat of glue over the entire diorama. As I mentioned before, if we paint with certain kinds, if we use certain kinds of paint, it's going to actually eat into the foam itself. So we want to put a protective layer over the entire piece. Also, we want to place a layer over top of the sand because that's going to prevent it from moving or shifting around as we put pieces in it. It's going to make it more durable, and also it's going to allow us to dry brush without accidentally getting sand into our paints later on. The consistency is going to be a little bit runnier than milk, but not quite as bad as water. And you can simply use the same container you did before and then add some more water to it, mix it, and get it to that consistency. So that's another reason why I really like using this container, because I can continue to change my ratios by simply adding more glue or adding more water depending on what it is that I'm doing. So I'm going to go ahead and get glue over the entire piece. A bigger brush is going to get this job done a lot quicker. So let's get to it. With all the glue applied, the next step is for us to let this thing completely dry. It's going to take probably 6 to 8 hours before you can really get into it again. Once that's done, then we're going to be ready for session 3, which is going to focus on painting and priming the piece and getting it ready for those details that we've been talking about. You want to make sure that everything is completely cured before we move on to session 3, which is where we're going to focus on priming and painting the diorama and getting it. While that dries, I'm going to get everything ready for session 3. So until next time, when we see you at the table.